On a warm night in the summer of 1647, in the imperial harem of Topkapi Palace, in Constantinople, a girl named Issa was shaken awake by hands she could not see. She was 20 years old, Circassian by birth, taken from her village at 12, sold at market in Cairo and shipped across the Mediterranean to serve the Ottoman Sultan. She had lived inside these walls for 8 years. She had never once stepped outside them. The hands belonged to a eunuch. His face was blank. He told her to get up. He told her to dress. He did not tell her why. Ace followed him into the corridor and found it full of women, dozens of them moving in the same direction, bare feet on cold tile, none of them speaking. The corridor smelled of rose water and tallow from the oil lamps mounted on the walls, and beneath that something older, the mineral scent of stone that never saw sunlight. She recognized faces. Layla, 17, Georgian, who played the ney flute so beautifully that the Sultan had once applauded. Fatma, 23, who had borne the Sultan a daughter and been rewarded with her own apartment and a salary that her family in Abkhazia would never know about. Old Hatties who had served in the harem since the reign of the previous Sultan and now washed linens in the lower quarters, all of them walking in silence toward the courtyard, and not one of them had been told why. In this courtyard more eunuchs waited. They stood in 2 rows, flanking a path that led toward the outer gate, the gate that opened onto the terrace overlooking the Bosphorus Strait. Ace had never been through that gate. No woman in the harem ever passed through it unless she was being transferred or released, and transfers happened in daylight ceremony. This was the middle of the night. Between the rows of eunuchs, she saw something that stopped her. Canvas sacks, dozens of them piled against the wall, each one large enough to hold a person. Beside the sacks, coils of rope. Beside the rope, stones, heavy river stones, each one the size of a man's head, stacked in neat rows as if someone had spent hours arranging them. I felt the blood leave her face. She understood now why the eunuch's expression had been blank. She understood why no one was speaking. She understood why they had been woken in darkness instead of summoned in daylight. The women around her were beginning to understand. Too, she could hear breathing change. The ragged sound of women who were realizing simultaneously that they had not been woken for a ceremony or a transfer or a punishment. They had been woken to die. At the far end of the courtyard, past the sacks and the stones and the ropes, the Kisla Ara stood, waiting, the chief black eunuch of the Ottoman Empire, the third most powerful official in the entire government, the man who controlled every entrance and exit of the harem, the man who decided which women the Sultan saw and which women disappeared. He held a needle and thread in his hands. He would personally sew the first sack shut. But before I tell you what happened in that courtyard, I need to take you back, because what the Ottoman sultans did to the women inside their harems was not a single act of madness by a single deranged ruler. It was a system. It was built over centuries. It was maintained by an empire, and the night Issa was shaken awake was not the beginning of the horror, it was the end of it. If you think you know how the Ottoman harem worked, this video will change your mind. You are going to learn how young girls were kidnapped from their villages and sold into the Sultan's household, trained for years in the arts of Obedience, how princes were locked in golden cages with women who had been deliberately sterilized to prevent them from ever bearing children, how the most powerful women in the empire poisoned and strangled each other for survival. A system that gave them exactly one path to power, and how one sultan, a man driven insane by 17 years of imprisonment, ordered 280 women sewn into weighted sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus on a single night. If this is the kind of history they never taught you in school, subscribe to the channel now, because this story only gets worse from here. To understand how a system this monstrous could exist, you need to understand the man at the center of it. Sultan Ibrahim. I was born in Constantinople on the 5th of November 1615, the youngest son of Sultan Ahmed, consort Qasim Sultan. Qasim was Greek by birth, originally named Anastasia, sold into the harem as a girl and risen through intelligence and ruthlessness to become one of the most powerful women. Ottoman history, she bore Ahmed multiple sons. This was both her greatest achievement and the source of everything that followed in the Ottoman Empire. There was no law of the eldest. Every son had equal claim to the throne. When a sultan died, his sons fought for power, and the winner strangled the losers with a silk burring. Since spilling royal blood was forbidden, Sultan Mehmed III had executed 19 of his brothers in a single day in 1595. Some of them infants carried to the executioner by their own nurses. The silk cord was the instrument of royal death in the Ottoman world. It was thin, strong, and left no visible wound on the body. The executioners were deaf mutes, chosen specifically because they could not hear the screams and could not repeat what they witnessed. To stop this cycle of mass fratricide, Sultan Ahmed I introduced a new system in 603. Instead of killing rival princes, he locked them away, the cafes, the cage. It was a suite of rooms deep within the hermit Topkapi Palace, decorated with painted ceilings and stained glass windows that filtered sunlight into patterns of blue and gold, furnished with silk divans and embroidered textiles, guarded every hour of every day by eunuchs who stood motionless outside the single entrance. It looked like a palace apartment. It functioned as a prison. Princes entered the coffers as young as 7 or 8 years old and remained there until they either ascended the throne or died of old age. Some spent decades inside. When Sultan Sulian II was finally released from the cafes in 1687, after 36 years of confinement, his first words were a question: if my death has been commanded, say so. Since my childhood I have suffered 40 years of imprisonment. He did not believe freedom was real. He assumed it was a trick. The princes in the cage were given tutors, servants, and food from the imperial kitchens. They were also given concubines, but only women who had been confirmed barren, because a prince in the cage was never permitted to father children. A rival heir with a son could threaten the dynasty. The concubines and the cafes served a dual purpose. They provided companionship for men who had no other human contact, and they kept the princes occupied so they would not plot rebellion. These women never left. If one somehow became pregnant despite being chosen for infertility, she was immediately drowned in the Bosphorus by the eunuchs. No trial, no investigation. The eunuchs enforced this rule without exception. Ibrahim entered the cafes at Age 8 when his older brother Murad IV took the throne in 1623. Murad was brilliant, violent, and alcoholic. He banned coffee and alcohol throughout the empire and personally executed anyone caught drinking. Despite being a raging alcoholic himself, he once cut off the head of a musician who played a Persian melody he disliked. He forced haram women to jump into a pool and then fired pellets at their bodies. He had a group of singing women drowned in the Bosphorus because their voices disturbed his peace. Drowning was already the standard punishment for women who angered the Sultan. Ibrahim did not invent it, he inherited it, and one by one over the years Murad strangled his brothers. He killed them in birth order, youngest to oldest, using the silk cord that Ottoman custom prescribed, and each time Ibrahim heard the footsteps of executioners passing his door, he did not know whether they were coming for the brother next in line or for him. By the time Murad was finished, Ibrahim was the only male of the Ottoman dynasty left alive. He was spared not out of mercy, but out of necessity. If Ibrahim died, the 600-year-old dynasty ended. Murad needed a spare, but Ibrahim did not know he was safe. He had no way of knowing. Every morning he woke inside those beautiful painted rooms, wondering if the door would open to reveal a eunuch with a cord. Every night he fell asleep knowing that his brother could change his mind at any moment. He fed fish in the palace pool with gold coins instead of food. He talked to walls, he screamed at shadows. Ibrahim spent 17 years in the cafes, 17 years behind walls he could not leave, surrounded by guards who watched his every movement, attended by sterilized women and castrated men, knowing that the only thing keeping him alive was the possibility that he might someday. Useful modern psychologists studying the effects of prolonged solitary confinement have documented that isolation lasting more than 15 days can produce hallucinations, chronic anxiety, and permanent changes to brain structure. Ibrahim endured not 15 days, but 17 years. His contemporaries had a simpler term for the result. They called him mad. When Murad died of cirrhosis at age 27 in 1640, the Grand Vizier came to Ibrahim's door to tell him he was now Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Ibrahim refused to believe it. He thought it was a trick, the final cruel game before the silk cord tightened around his throat. He barricaded himself inside the cafes, pushing furniture against the door, and would not come out. His mother Qasim came to the door and spoke to him through the wood, begging him to open it. He refused. Guards came, he refused. Ministers came, he refused. It was only when they carried Murad's corpse through the corridors of the harem and laid it outside Ibrahim's barricaded door for him to inspect through a crack in the would that he finally slowly opened the door and touched the dead body with his own hands to confirm it was real. He was 24 years old. He had spent more than 2/3 of his life in a cage, and now he controlled an empire that stretched from Baghdad to Vienna with an army of hundreds of thousands, a treasury that funded wars across 3 continents, and a harem containing nearly 300 women, whose bodies and lives belonged entirely to him. The historian Noel Barber wrote that once on the throne, Ibrahim proved to be the most detestable and debauched of all the Ottoman sultans, but some Modern historians, including Scott Rank, have suggested that Ibrahim's opponents spread rumors of insanity to justify his deposition and that he may have been more incompetent than truly mad. Distinction matters less than you might think whether Ibrahim was clinically insane or merely shattered beyond repair by decades of trauma. The result for the women in his harem was the same. The women in that harem did not arrive by choice. Young girls of extraordinary beauty were sent to the Sultan's court as gifts from provincial governors seeking favor. Most were Caucasian, Georgian, or Abkhazian, taken from villages in the mountain regions between the Black Sea and the Caspian. They were bought at slave markets after being kidnapped from their families by armed raiders or sold by parents too poor to feed them. During famines, the slave caravans moved through the Caucasus and across the Black Sea to Constantinople, and the journey killed many of the girls. Before they arrived, those who survived were inspected on arrival at the palace by the valid sultan herself or by senior harem women acting on her behalf. Girls who arrived at Topkapi were sorted into a hierarchy that would define the rest of their lives. Those considered plain became careers. The lowest rank, servant girls who claimed, cooked and laundered for the women above them. They lived in large dormitories beneath the apartments of the consorts and slept on thin mats on stone floors. Those considered beautiful were placed on a different track entirely. They became potential concubines and their training began. Immediately, they learned Turkish if they did not already speak it. They memorized passages of the Quran. They were taught to belly dance, to recite classical Persian poetry from memory, to play the oud and the ney and the kanan. They studied court etiquette under the supervision of the Kaya Kadin, the head stewardess, who enforced discipline with beatings for any infraction. They were taught what the Ottoman sources called the arts of companionship, a set of skills designed to please the Sultan. His private chambers, the training took years. A girl might enter the harem at 12 and not be presented to the Sultan until she was 18 or 20, by which time she had been transformed from a kidnapped village child into a polished, multilingual, musically accomplished woman whose entire identity had been rebuilt around one purpose: the possibility that the Sultan might notice her. If the Sultan took a girl to his bed, her status changed overnight. She received her own chamber, her own servants, her own kitchen staff, a personal eunuch assigned exclusively to her, and a salary paid from the imperial treasury. If she became pregnant, she moved to larger apartments. If she bore a son, she became one of the most powerful people in the empire, because her son might one day sit on the throne, and if he did, she would rule beside him as valid sultan. If she bore a son and that son eventually became sultan, she became the queen mother, the supreme authority within the harem, with power over life and death for every woman inside its walls. This created a system where women had exactly one path to power, and that path ran through the Sultan's bedroom. The competition was lethal. It had to be in a world where your son's survival depended on your influence, and your influence depended on the Sultan's favor. Every other woman who shared his bed was not just a rival, but an existential threat. Harem history is filled with women who clawed their way to the top and destroyed anyone who threatened their position, Mahidien. Sultana mutilated the face of her rival. Roxalana with her fingernails, tearing gashes so deep they left permanent scars. Gulu Sultana Pushte. Competing concubine named Gulbazov. Cliff Herm Sultana was strangled in her own chambers. Bezelam Sultana vanished one day and was never seen again. Her body never found, her fate never explained. Every glass of sherbet offered in the harem was potentially poisoned. Every friendship was potentially a trap. Every woman who smiled at you might be the woman who arranged your death. Now think about what happens when you place a man who spent 17 years in solitary confinement, who watched his brothers be murdered, who suffers from what modern clinicians would recognize as severe psychological damage at the absolute center of this system, with no checks on his behavior whatsoever. Even before Ibrahim reached his worst, the drowning system was already operational in his household. Early in his reign, while he was still a prince confined to the cafes, a Georgian concubine named Zafira became pregnant. In violation of harem rules, Qasim Sultan ordered the Kisla Ara, a eunuch named Sumbul Ara, to drown her. Instead, Sumbul hid Zafira in his own quarters, where she gave birth to a son named Osman. When Qasim discovered this, she exiled all three of them to Egypt. Their ship was attacked by the knights of Malta, and Zapier and her son were captured. Zafira died in captivity. Her son was raised Christian on the island of Malta under the name Domenico Ottomano, an Ottoman prince who grew up in a foreign country, never knowing the father who had been locked in a cage, or the grandmother who had ordered his mother drowned. This was the system working normally. This was what passed for routine. Ibrahim's mother Qasim encouraged him to spend as much time as possible in the harem. This served two purposes. It kept Ibrahim distracted and out of state affairs, which Qasim preferred to manage herself, and it ensured that Ibrahim fathered heirs, which was critical because he was the last surviving male of the Ottoman line. If he died without sons, 600 years of dynasty ended. Qasim personally went to the slave markets to select girls she thought would hold her son's attention. She knew his preferences. She studied what kept him calm and what triggered his rages. She curated the harem around him like a handler managing a dangerous animal, but the harem was not managed by Qasim alone. The machinery of daily control belonged to the eunuchs, and understanding the eunuch system is essential to understanding how the harem functioned, because these were the men who would carry out the drownings. The eunuchs of the Ottoman harem were boys taken from East Africa, primarily from Abyssinia, Nubia, and the Upper Nile Valley. They were captured through slave raids at around 7 or 8 years old, transporting by caravan through Sudan to Cairo and castrated thereby. Specialized operators, often Coptic monks, in a procedure that involved complete removal. The mortality rate was catastrophic. Historians estimate that only 10 to 20% of boys survived the operation. Those who lived through it was healed over several months and then shipped to Constantinople, where their rarity made them extraordinarily valuable. At the top of this hierarchy sat the Kisla Aga, the chief black eunuch, formerly titled the Aga of the House of Felicity. He held the rank of Pasha and was the third most powerful official in the entire Ottoman Empire behind only the Sultan and the Grand Vizier. He controlled every entrance and exit of the harem. He decided which women the Sultan saw and when. He managed the finances, supervised the education of the princes, organized festivals and ceremonies, and served as the sole intermediary between the Grand Vizier and the Sultan. No minister, not even the Grand Vizier himself, could enter the harem without the Kisla Ara's permission. At the peak of the system in the 17th century, the harem employed between 800 and 1200 eunuchs. They stood at every door. They accompanied every woman who moved from one section of the harem to another. They listened to every conversation, and when a woman violated the rules, it was the eunuchs who administered punishment for lesser offenses, beatings for serious offenses, exile for the gravest offense of all, drowning in the Bosphorus. It was the Kisla Ara himself who sewed the sack shut. Ibrahim took to the harem with an intensity that disturbed even his handlers. He was reputed to take 24 different concubines in a single day. Over the course of 7 years, his concubines bore him 18 children. He had mirrors installed on the walls and ceilings of his private chambers, so he could watch himself. The Mulavian chronicler Dimitri Cantemir, a soldier and statesman who documented Ottoman court life from direct observation, recorded that Ibrahim would assemble the women in the palace gardens, order them to strip, and then run among them, neighing like a stallion. He drenched palace furnishings in amber perfume, which is known to cause dizziness and disorientation in enclosed spaces. He adorned his beard with diamonds. He stuffed his pillows with sable fur. He once saw the hind quarters of a cow, and was so taken with the shape that he had a golden cast made and sent it around the empire with instructions to find a woman whose body matched it. He developed an obsession with sable fur. After one of his concubines told him a story about a sable king, Ibrahim sent agents to every corner of the empire to bring back sable. He lined entire palace walls with it. He had cats dressed in sable coats and paraded through the halls. He carpeted the palace of Ibrahim Pasha entirely in sable and gave it to one of his wives, Teli Haseki. The cost was staggering, paid from a treasury already strained by the war in Crete and a Venetian naval blockade that was slowly starving Constantinople. But Ibrahim's most notorious obsession was with large women. He searched the empire for its heaviest woman. His agents found her, an Armenian from Constantinople named Sivikar, said to weigh over 300 lb. Ibrahim became so infatuated with her that he elevated her to the rank of Haski Sultan, showered her with wealth beyond what any concubine had received before, and declared her governor-general of Damascus, giving a former slave administrative authority over one of the greatest cities in the Ottoman world. He gave her the land and jewels that had belonged to his own sisters, humiliating Ottoman princesses, women of royal blood, to reward a woman he had purchased from a slave market. Ibrahim also once took a liking to the infant son of a slave woman and began to prefer this unrelated child over his own firstborn son. Memed. When Memed's mother Turhan complained, Ibrahim flew into a rage, grabbed the toddler Memed from her arms and threw him into a pool. The child would have drowned if a servant had not pulled him out. Memed survived with a permanent scar on his forehead. He was 3 years old. Sika, whom everyone called Sugar Cube, was not merely a favorite, she was a political operator, she whispered in Ibrahim's ear during the hours when his paranoia was strongest, in the early morning when he woke screaming from nightmares about the cafes, in the late evening when the amber perfume thickened the air and his thoughts spiraled. She told him which women to trust and which to fear. She told him secrets real or invented about other concubines, and she used Ibrahim's paranoia, the deep and permanent paranoia of a man who had spent his formative years expecting to be murdered at any moment, to destroy anyone who threatened her position. When one concubine drew the Sultan's attention, Sivakar made sure the attention did not last. When another gained influence, Sivakar planted doubt. She was not the first woman in her history to rule through the Sultan's ear rather than his bed. She was simply the most dangerous, because the Sultan she controlled was already broken. Ibrahim raised 8 concubines simultaneously to the rank of Heki royal consort, something no Sultan had ever done before or would ever do again. The title had once been reserved for a single favored woman. Ibrahim debased it into a tool of extravagance, giving each of his 8 Hakis land, wealth, servants, and political influence. He stripped his sisters and nieces of their property to fund these gifts. His mother Qasim watched this with growing alarm, not because of the cost, although the cost was ruinous, but because Ibrahim's concubines were beginning to exercise real political power. They influenced the appointment of provincial governors. They interfered with military decisions. They answered to no one except Ibrahim, and Ibrahim answered to no one at all. Qasim had survived decades of Ottoman court politics through intelligence and patience. She had outlived her husband Ahmed. She had managed her son Murad's violent reign without being killed by it. She had kept Ibrahim alive in the cafes when Murad wanted him dead. She understood with the clarity of a woman who had governed an empire from behind the walls of a harem that the state could not be run by a man who lined rooms with fur and appointed concubines to provincial governorships. She also understood that Sivar was the engine driving Ibrahim's worst impulses. So Qasim invited Sivakar to dinner. According to the English diplomat Paul Ryko, who documented Ottoman court life in extraordinary detail during this period, Qasim had Sivakar strangled. During the meal, she then told Ibrahim that Sugar Cube had died suddenly of a violent illness. Ibrahim was devastated. He mourned her for weeks. He refused food. He wept in his sable-lined chambers, but Shivakar's death did not solve the problem. It made it catastrophically worse. With Sugar Cube gone, Ibrahim's paranoia had no filter. There was no longer anyone whispering his ear to direct his suspicions at specific targets. Instead, his suspicion turned everywhere at once. He became convinced that women throughout the harem were conspiring against him. He ordered investigations. He had women interrogated. The eunuchs conducted the questioning under his direct orders. No one confessed, because there was nothing to confess. And this is where the story returns to that courtyard on a summer night in Constantinople. Because Sivakar was gone, but the damage she had done lived after her. Before her death, she had planted one final piece Of poison in Ibrahim's mind, she told him that one of his concubines had been intimate with a man from outside the harem. She did not say which one. She may not have known. She may have invented the entire story to keep Ibrahim dependent on her investigative abilities, never expecting that she would die before the matter was resolved. Ibrahim ordered the Kisla Ara to investigate. Women were questioned under threat and under pain. None could identify the guilty party because there may never have been one. Ibrahim's rage built for weeks, then months. He interrogated women personally. He demanded names. He received none. The eunuchs reported failure after failure. The investigation turned the entire harem into a place of terror where every woman suspected every other woman of informing, and where the Sultan's shadow in a corridor was enough to make a room fall silent. And then one night he made his decision. He ordered every woman in his harem gathered in the courtyard. 280 of them, women he had taken to his bed, women who had borne his children, women who had spent years training poetry and music and dance for the privilege of serving him, women who had been torn from their families as children and shipped across seas they would never cross again, women who had done nothing except exist inside a system they had never chosen to enter. All of them brought to the courtyard in darkness, barefoot on stone that was still warm from the day's heat. Some of them understood immediately. The women who had been in the haram longest, who had witnessed punishments before, who had seen the sacks used on individual women accused of specific crimes, recognized what was happening the moment they saw the canvas piled against the wall. They began to cry. Others stood in confusion, still half asleep, not yet comprehending why they had been woken or why the eunuchs who had dressed them and fed them and escorted them to the baths every morning were now standing in rigid formation with their faces turned to stone. The youngest girls, some of them barely older than children, recent arrivals who had not yet finished their training, had never seen a drowning sack at all, and did not know what the canvas was for. The eunuchs had prepared everything in advance. The sacks were canvas large enough to contain a human body, with room for the stones that would drag it to the bottom of the strait. The Kisla Ara, the chief black eunuch, the man who had overseen these women's daily lives for years, who had arranged their meals and supervised their education and decided which ones the Sultan would see on any given night, who had managed their pregnancies and their illnesses and their arguments and their friendships, personally sewed the first sacks shut with a heavy needle and thread he carried for this purpose. The other eunuchs followed his example. They had been trained for this. Drowning in the Bosphorus was the standard method of execution for women who violated her law. What made this night different was not the method, it was the scale. Each woman was placed inside a sack. Stones were added, heavy river stones, each one the size of a man's head, enough to ensure the sack would not float. The sack was sewn closed, with the woman still alive inside it, still breathing, still able to feel the rough canvas against her skin and the weight of the stones pressing against her body. Then the sack was carried by eunuchs to the terrace, the same terrace where the Sultan sometimes stood in the evening to watch boats pass on the Bosphorus and thrown over the wall into the water. Below, the Bosphorus at that point runs. Deep and fast, the current pulls southward toward the Sea of Marmura. Weighted sack sinks within seconds. The women inside had time to feel the cold. Water rushed through the weave of the canvas, time to feel their bodies pull downward by the stones, time to understand that the surface was moving away from them and that no one was going to pull them back, drowning in an enclosed space takes between 2 and 4 minutes. The brain remains conscious for most of that time. Modern neuroscience confirms that drowning victims experience a cascade of panic, suffocation, and finally a reflexive inhalation of water that fills the lungs. With fluid, there is nothing quick about it, there is nothing painless about it. 280 women experienced this in sequence, one after another, sack after sack, over the course of a single night. Multiple sources from the period confirm the event. The Mulavian chronicler Cantemir documented it, European diplomats reported it, Ottoman court records reference it, though historians continue to debate whether the number 280 is precise or approximate. What is not debated is that it happened, that it was ordered by the Sultan, that it was carried out by the eunuchs, and that the evidence was found afterward. Accounts describe fishermen in the Bosphorus pulling weighted sacks from the water. For days after the drownings, French divers working in the Strait decades later reportedly found sacks still on the sea floor, weighted down by stones that had kept them in place long after the canvas had begun to rot. All but 1 or 2 women died. The survivors were spared either by accident or by specific intervention. One of the survivors was then Hatish, a Ukrainian concubine who was the mother of Ibrahim's eldest son. Maimed, she lived because killing the mother of the heir would have endangered the succession that kept the dynasty alive. Turhan Hatish survived the night. She remembered what happened. She remembered the sound of it, the splashing and the silence that followed. The eunuchs carrying sacks passed her in the darkness while she stood in the courtyard, knowing that the only reason she was still breathing was because of the child she had given the Sultan 3 years earlier. She would carry that memory for the rest of her life, and she would use it. Ibrahim continued to rule for another year after the drownings. He replaced the dead women with new ones, purchased from the same slave markets, transported along the same routes, trained in the same skills, installed in the same chambers where the previous occupants had slept the night before they were sewn into sacks. The harem refilled, the system continued. The eunuchs who had carried sacks to the terrace went back to their posts at the doors and resumed their duties as if nothing had changed, because within the logic of the system nothing had. The Sultan's will was absolute. The women were property. Property could be disposed of and replaced, but outside the harem walls, Ibrahim's rule was collapsing. He had emptied the treasury through years of extravagance, sable carpets and diamond beards and gifts to 8 simultaneous hasses, while the empire fought a war it could not afford. He had started a disastrous conflict with Venice over the island of Crete, a war that would drag on for 25 years and drain Ottoman resources for a generation. The Venetian navy blockaded the Dinals, the narrow strait connecting the Mediterranean to Constantinople, cutting off the Capital's grain supply, bread prices, quadrupled, markets emptied, taxes were raised again and again to fund Ibrahim's spending, and the money disappeared into the haram while soldiers went unpaid and ordinary citizens went hungry. In 1647, Qasim Sultan and the Grand Vizier Salih Pasha attempted to depose Ibrahim and replace him with one of his young sons. The plot failed. Ibrahim had Salih Pasha executed and exiled his own mother from the haram, sending her to a garden estate outside the city. With Qasim gone, Ibrahim appointed a new corrupt grand vizier who would let him do whatever he wanted and resumed his life in the harem as the empire crumbled around him. But the forces gathering against Ibrahim were now too powerful to stop. In August of 1648, the Janissaries revolted. The elite soldiers of the Ottoman Empire, the men who had conquered half the known world, the most feared fighting force in Europe, marched on the capital. They seized Ibrahim's Grand Vizier, Ahmed Pasha, in the streets of Constantinople. An angry mob strangled him, and then they tore his body apart so completely that he earned the posthumous nickname Hezar Par, which means 1,000 pieces, not a metaphor, a description. On the 8th of August, Ibrahim was captured inside the palace and dragged back to the coffers, the cage, the same rooms where he had spent 17 years of his childhood, listening to his brothers die. His 6-year-old son, Mehmed, the boy he had once thrown into a pool, was placed on the throne. Qasim was brought back from exile to serve as regent. 10 days later, the new Grand Vizier obtained a fatwa from the Shaykh Islam, the highest religious authority in the empire, authorizing Ibrahim's execution. The ruling was delivered in a single sentence: if there are 2 caliphs, kill one of them. Qasim gave her consent to her own son's death. She said, in the end, he will leave neither you nor me alive. We will lose control of the government. The whole society is in ruins. Have him removed from the throne. Immediately, 2 executioners came for Ibrahim in the cafes. One of them was his own former chief executioner, a man who had served under Ibrahim for years and carried out dozens of strangulations on his orders. When Ibrahim saw them approach, he understood what was happening. He began to scream. His last recorded words echo across 4 centuries: is there no one among those who have eaten my bread who will take pity on me and protect me? These cruel men have come to kill me. Mercy, mercy. His mother watched from a window of the palace as the executioners looped a silk burring around Ibrahim's neck and pulled it tight. He was 32 years old. He had ruled for 8 years. He died the same way. His brothers had died the same way. Countless Ottoman princes and rivals and inconvenient women had died before them, strangled by the same empire that had created him, in the same cage where he had lost his mind. His death was the second reside in Ottoman history. It would not be the last. The story did not end with Ibrahim's death. The system that produced him continued to grind forward, consuming women and princes and eunuchs with the same mechanical efficiency it had maintained for centuries. His mother, Qasim, became regent for the 6-year-old Sultan Mehmed. Roman 4, she ruled the empire as she always had, through intelligence, manipulation, and strategic violence. But the harem she governed still operated by the same rules that had governed it before. The drownings, women still competed for Power through the Sultan's bed, women still poisoned and strangled each other. For position, women still entered the system as kidnapped children from the Caucasus and left it only through death, or the rare mercy of a sultan who freed elderly concubines he no longer desired. The slave caravans still moved through Sudan and across the Black Sea. The eunuchs still stood at the doors 3 years after Ibrahim's execution. Turhan, Hatish, the concubine who had survived the mass drowning, the woman who had stood in that courtyard and watched 280 of her companions carried to the terrace in sacks moved against Qasim. Turhan was Mim's mother. She wanted the regency for herself, and she wanted Qasim gone permanently. The conflict between the two women, grandmother and mother of this same child, Sultan, was the final act of a power struggle that had been building since the night of the drownings. On the 2nd of September 1651, the chief black eunuch Div Suleiman Ara was sent to find Qasim in the harem, the old woman who had survived her husband. Sultan Ahmed managed one violent son. Murad endured another mad son. Ibrahim consented to that mad son's execution and governed an empire for more than 30 years. Ran through the maze of corridors she knew better than anyone alive, stuffing jewels into her pockets as she fled. She knew every passage, every hidden door, every shortcut through the 400 rooms of the harem she had ruled for decades. It did not save her. The eunuch caught her in a storage room. He strangled her by twisting her own braids around her neck. She was 62 years old when the people of Constantinople heard that Qasim Sultan was dead. They closed the mosques and the bazaars for 3 days. The great Ottoman traveller Evia Selby recorded her death with grief, calling her a gracious benefactress who was martyred. The people mourned the woman who had ordered her own son's execution. They did not mourn the women her son had drowned. The 280 concubines were never mentioned in public mourning. They had no families in Constantinople to demand justice. They had no political allies to remember them. They had been property. And when property is destroyed, empires do not hold funerals. The harem at Topkapi Palace continued to operate for another 250 years after the drownings. Sultans continued to acquire concubines from slave markets. Eunuchs continued to guard the doors. The cafes continued to produce damaged men and hand them absolute power. The last concubines were set free in 1909 when Sultan Abdul Hamid Roman II was exiled to Salonika, and 370 women walked out of the gates they had entered as children and saw the streets of Constantinople for the first time in their lives. 127 eunuchs walked out with them. Some of the freed women had spent 50 years inside. The palace was converted into a museum. The last known surviving eunuch of the Ottoman harem, a man named Sadi Ara, was found by journalists in a cafe in the town of Tuzla in the 1950s. When they asked him about his past, he refused to speak. We have long forgotten the past, he said. Let us focus on the present. We are uneducated people. What would we know anyway? You can visit Top Copy today. You can walk through the corridors where women walked on that summer night nearly 400 years ago. You can see the courtyard of the favorites, the tiny windows of the cafes, overlooking a large empty pool. This apartments where women lived and competed and died for centuries. You can stand on the terrace and look down at The Bosphorus at the same dark water, where 280 weighted sacks sank to the bottom while the Sultan watched from somewhere inside the palace, and the eunuchs carried sack after sack to the edge. Current still runs, the water tells you. Nothing was a monster, or was he? The inevitable product of a system that locked children in cages and then handed them absolute power over hundreds of human lives. Could anyone have emerged sane from 17 years of imprisonment, watching their brothers be murdered one by one? Does understanding how he was broken excuse what he did to the women, who had no more choice in being there than he did? Tell me what you think in the comments if this story changed how you see the Ottoman Empire. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe if you have not already. 280 women went into the water that night. Most of them had been taken from their homes as children. None of them were asked, none of them were charged with a crime, none of them were given a chance to speak. They were sewn into sacks by the men who had guarded them for years, carried to the edge of the terrace by the men who had fed them and dressed them and arranged their lives down to the smallest detail, and dropped into the dark water of the Bosphorus. Like stones, they did not have names in the historical record. They were counted, not named. They were called the Sultan's women, but every one of them had a name once in a village somewhere before the slave traders.